Great. So caching is a very important piece in software development and it comes at various levels. We'll talk about that in detail. That is why I wanted to put it in the forum and the community to understand how they see this subject of caching. So this is the poll which I put on various social media and people responded to it. Let's understand what they think about caching and why they think about caching. That is the most important piece here. So these are the poll results. So on one of the platform, people said 52.4% yes, it is absolutely necessary. Why they are saying, we'll see about that. 42.9% are saying it depends on scale. So and 4.8% are saying they don't have any idea. From this live feed, we will try to close this feed with the understanding what caching is. So 4.8% people who don't have any idea will have some idea, and the two major segment of the people, first segment which believes you have to think about caching from the very first day, and other segment says you caching is important but it should not be thought from the first day, rather when you have sufficient user scale you think about caching. So these two fragments are there. We'll try to give more perspective to both of this segment so they understand, or rather get their wisdom scattered around with the people who are listening this podcast, so that they understand why they have chosen particular option. Okay, so let's move ahead. Now in other platform, uh, we got 931 votes. 351 votes are saying yes, it is absolutely necessary. 478 people says it depends on scale. Again the same result. There are two major sections. One believe caching is important but not initially, and other is saying yes, it is, it should be thought from the first day. 76 people, quite significant people, don't have any understanding. Why I am asking this question, what is this caching all about? We'll try to understand in this live feed. Moving ahead, similar result, yes, absolutely, 67%, and depends on scale 33%. Let's take some of the comments that I received on the poll and we'll try to answer it or even understand what they are trying to say about the poll or even the options. So one of the comment is the right answer isn't on the poll. Fair enough, it is possible because caching is such a vast implementation. You can think about caching from registers that is in the CPU that enables calculations at the OS level. You can then think about caching at the internet web layer where resources lie closest to the user so that the round trip with the server is minimized. Then you can think about caching as a piece to reduce the calculation that take place at the backend side. You can think about caching even in a program where you don't want to calculate something again and again because things are not changing a lot. So caching has a very vast application. He might be thinking in from the lens that we're talking about scale, or why caching we're not talking about from the OS perspective. So might be that is the reason. But yes, the point of this poll was to either take caching in consideration from the first day or take caching as an important piece when scale arrives. So we could have fault. So moving ahead, now it says scale sort of. Fair enough. Ultimately at large, very large scale, real-time data just isn't realistic. What he is talking about, we can think from the perspective of a Facebook type of service, for example. So we have client distributed all over the world. Everyone is trying to get some real-time data from chat or from the feed, and we cannot make that real-time calculation or availability between different servers. because we have a lot of servers in a distributed network. Even transmitting the information from one origin piece of service to the another piece, there will be some latency, it will take some time. So real time is not possible even if we don't think of a cache. So if we real time data is not possible, why don't we do some caching strategy? We'll see what exactly does it mean. But fair point, real time data at scale is not even possible. Now let's move ahead. Yeah, so there are further responses to some of the replies. For example, Redis cache is talking about in comparison to Webpack bundling. From the perspective of web development, you have source code for React.js or let's say Vue.js. Those need to be compiled. Any framework of JavaScript written in TypeScript or even some framework which does a lot of uh, processing, the JSX you are using. So you need to compile that source code into a plain JavaScript files, which is then served. And these bundler tools like Webpack, they help achieve that task. But the cost on processing that files is huge. So you cannot make it real-time processing. You have to pre-process it in some way. You are caching that result. So that is what he is saying, that is costly, and serving it from the cache is much cheaper. Now somebody is saying that I would say always. Okay, fair point. If you know that your application is going to evolve into that form where it would be used by a large number of audiences, large number of users, you should think about caching from the very first day. Okay. Now there is another reply which says absolutely, it depends on scale. So don't think about caching from the first day. Think about caching when the scale arrives or when you anticipate the scale, as well as the quality of DB integration and design. What it says that how you are using your database to query. For example, if you have designed the light database, most of the things are indexed, query time is much smaller, then you don't think about caching at that stage where number of users become very large, number of connections to the database become very large. You don't think about that. If the database design is not good enough, if you have queries which are not indexable, or there are structure where there are a lot of relations are there and the query required to go through multiple collections or tables, then you should think about caching before. So it will depend on the scale, but also depend on how you have designed your database and what time your database queries are taking. So very good point. Now one comment is, I didn't think this was a very good question. Somebody thought this was not a very good question. Okay, and I thought 95% would pick 3. Well, now don't I look dumb? Okay, so he's thinking from his perspective, the third option, that caching should only be thought at scale. But most of the people did not agree. 50% of the people are saying that you should think about caching from the very first day. So some revelation he might have got. So that is what I also want my audience to understand, that few things that we think are obvious may not be very obvious. There could be other perspective to that thought as well. Okay, let's move ahead. I wonder why people choose 1 and not 3. Every abstraction you add to your code needs a reason, because everything has a cost. If you implement caching without actual need, you waste everyone time and money. So the answer is almost always it depends. Again, a very strong pointer from someone for option 3. Think about caching at scale, not from the first day. Because if you lay down that abstraction where code is being developed with caching in mind, then it will have added cost. Okay, fair point, but again you have to think about the time when we reach that point where you have to really use cache and your code base is not ready enough to accommodate for that sort of change. It would be really difficult at that point of time. So from that perspective, it might not be great idea to wait for the time when it is absolutely necessary, but have some uh, consideration beforehand when you expect something to really grow at some point of time. Okay, always depend on what you are building. Okay, this is very generic answer, that is fine. Very interesting. No, don't need caching. When you press refresh, yes. So basically he's trying to say, if some resource is being asked again and again, then you think about caching. If something is asked only once, you don't think about caching. Very good, very innovative approach of answer. Depends on the use case. Okay, use case, this is a very generic way of putting answer. When you say depends on the use case, then you are not able to define the boundary of your use cases that you're talking about. Some use case might be very frequent, some use case might come once or twice. For example, if you are creating a web services that is going to serve static resources, then most obvious answer is yes, because the use case 90% chance is there that you would be serving some static assets which will be retrieved by the user again and again. So use case in context of web development is 100%. And if we see about the major development spaces, for example backend services, web development, mobile services, even your software, every place has caching implementation. So caching have a very major role to play in the development or even design of your software. So use case is there, and now we are trying to understand, should we think about the caching and the first day, or should we think about when the scale arrives or when the use case basically its demand arises. So this answer is very generic, so not moving ahead with this. Depends on the use case. Again somebody is elaborating on the fact that you cannot be so generic in giving this reply. I agree to this fact. If you start setting, if you work, if your working set is fitting in database memory and the data is not static, better keep it in the database only. Okay, fine. So what he's saying ki working set is fitting in database memory, data is not static, means data is changing very frequently and it fits into the database memory. Why think about cache, he's saying. Okay, fine. Static data with no changes over time are eligible for some sort of caching mechanism. Again he is giving a perspective that which asset you think about for caching. If it is static, does not change a lot, then you think about stacking. If it change frequently, don't think about it. Okay, fine. Another vote. I think we have come to the end of the poll. So this was the result that we got on the social media and the opinions of various people and the comments we discussed. Now let's try to understand the context where the caching appears. If anybody has any question, please put it in the chat. I'll try to reply or take the question. I'm pausing for 2 minutes to just get all the questions, then we'll move ahead. Great, so we'll move ahead and so these are some of the things I want to talk about, making it very effective session rather than very detailed. We'll talk about the major pieces so that we can understand the poll results. The main idea is to understand why people have different preferences. Rather than going in detail of the implementation, we'll have some other session where we talk about different caching strategies and how it should be implemented in the code base. For this live chat or live video, we want to just address to the point that why caching people have chosen different option. So first point is, what is caching? So what is caching? We must describe it from the perspective of its purpose. So caching means to make the resources available to the end users as closest as possible. So basically, let's try to understand, this is your user and this is some resource. We want the resource to be as closer to the user as possible. Why? Because user is asking for that resource to interact with it or to read it, to store it, whatever the purpose of the user might be. Putting the resource closest to the user is the purpose of caching. This is the fundamental thing. Now, what are the context in which the caching appears? Let's say I have some server and a user wants to access some resource from the server. So it will go through the network, internet, and will get that resource. Now think about it. If I need that resource and I'll go back to the server through the internet again and again, and if the resource transmission takes, let's say, X amount of time, let's say 2 seconds, then each time I'm trying to access this resource, I will have to wait for 2 seconds, and that is not good experience from the user's perspective. So we might want to first reduce this distance from the network for the user and the resource. The first point is location of the resource. Second point is, if suppose I am accessing some resource which is saved on disk, and disk will have to do an IO operation to fetch that resource from the disk and to show it to the user. So IO operation will take some time. So we would want to place that resource into the fastest memory available. Fastest memory available would be RAM in most of the case. So there are majorly two things which comes into the caching. First is location of the cache, and second is the storage of the cache. Okay, I have a question. What would be the strategy to flush the caching data? Now, very good point. The most this answer is not straightforward. It will depend on many things. First, we must understand what we are storing. Let's say we are storing information about a user likes, for example, and that likes changes very frequently. So we'll have to provide some invalidation strategy. So one is we define the expiration time, and second is to define an invalidation strategy. So whenever we store a data, we define when it is going to be expired in the cache. When it is expired, then the cache will ask the original source for the updated data. Or we provide some invalidation strategy that if, let's say, something is accessed 3 times, then you ask me again. So depending on the use case, we have different ways to really manage the stored data. And how we can, suppose we have found that this data is stale, and we have found the new updated data, we'll simply update it. But if suppose our cache is full or our buffer is full, then which item to remove is another piece for that problem. So there, either we can remove the last accessed item, or we can randomly remove some of the items. So there are various strategies. LRU cache is the most used in the industry, with the last red item is removed. Any other question, please go ahead, or if you want to discuss more on it. Okay, let's move ahead, and we were talking about caching. So caching, there are two objectives. First, to define the location and the storage. Location, we want to keep it closer to the user. So we will talk from the perspective of internet or network. So there are two important pieces. Let's talk about web caching in browsers. So browser cache enables the images to be stored locally so that you don't go into the round trip with the server and fetch that resource. We use the browser cache to store the images, scripts, CSS, all the assets that you feel is not going to change a lot. You can call the web browser to store it for you on the cache. Second is using your RAM to store processed data on the server side. So a use case that I have, in my application Curious Junior, where I had to develop the leaderboard. Leaderboard was to serve for the quizzes. So we have live quizzes, and anybody can give the quiz and compete with the other person. So let's say the two person who came to the platform, to the app, and they gave the answers and they got a rank. So two people came to the leaderboard, 1 and 2. Now the third person also came after them. He also gave the answer. Now their ranking will shuffle. Might be possible rank 1 becomes rank 1 only, stays at rank 1, and third person becomes rank 2, and rank 2 person becomes rank 3. So we have to update the leaderboard. So leaderboard 1 state goes to leaderboard 2nd state. This is changing very frequently. But the point is, this leaderboard contain queries which is coming from a lot of table, and this query is really expensive. So for the server, either we can have a server with very high configuration, or we think about reducing the processing so that we can have efficient servers with efficient cost running for our company. So there caching strategies we put up. And how we did solve this problem was through a Redis cache. So whenever a leaderboard is created, we store that in the Redis cache, and whenever there is an update required for the other user, we fetch the leaderboard which is already stored in the Redis and update that leaderboard and serve it to the user. So in that way, it saved a lot of processing for us. So here the RAM processing, that is in memory cache we call it, is being used by our servers. There's very interesting problem here that we solved. Let's say there are 5 concurrent users who is trying to update the list. How do we solve this problem? Because your Redis cache allows to watch one of the keys and in effect allows a transaction. But if there are 5 different people concurrently trying to update that list, it does not have the system of lock, but they have an optimistic locks mechanism which they call, essentially keep trying to update the cache till it passes through. So there will be a race condition among the 5 updates, and eventually one will proceed, then second, then fourth. So this is the mechanism of the Redis, a very important or very interesting use case here. We'll talk about this in some other live session. So we were talking about caching being important from two lenses. First is location and another is storage. Location we can reduce by using browser cache. Second, using CDN. CDN allows us to store the information closer to the server, which is closer to the user. So let's suppose we have a service which is being accessed by users from all over the world. We would want that content to be accessible to the user from the nearest server to that user, because the round trip would be minimum, the network cost would be smaller. So if I am from India, so a server of Facebook which is in India would be the most efficient server for me to ask for something. So CDN allows to cache the static resources like your images, your style sheets and other resources, which does not change a lot in the server which is located nearer to the user. And when the user asks, it goes to the proxy server and identifies the closest server and then serves the user. So that is the CDN. So one is CDN, another is web browser, that comes in the location piece. From the storage perspective, it is the in-memory cache. We can store the data in the fastest accessible memory, and RAM comes to be the happens to be the memory which is the fastest for us. So we talked about what is caching. We talked about in-memory cache, that is RAM. For the web caching, we have web client, that is your browsers, and the web server, which is essentially you are building the webpack using webpack tools, or you are using storing your images on the server. So there you are putting the cache at your server level and minimizing your processing, so that comes into the web server web caching. And another is CDN caching. So there you are trying to make the resource available within the closest location to the user. You are trying to make that resource available. So this is caching, and there are various strategies that comes into play which we talked about. Please go ahead, ask any question, any doubt you have, please go ahead. Okay, great. So we will move ahead. We can talk about caching as much as possible. It would be even less. So what we will do, we will host independent sessions on different topics of caching. First, we will start with web caching. Then we will move and talk about cache at the server level, or let me call it backend cache. Then we will talk about some system caching, various other use cases of caching. For example, even our video editor uses caching, so that does not have to calculate a lot and can utilize the processing capacity in the more efficient manner. So caching always helps to reduce your processing and in a way maximize your utilization of the resources. So there are three things we will talk about in coming live sessions, and in this session we try to understand what is caching, in which context we can talk or we must consider caching, and we looked at the poll result and why people choose different options. First option, people with experience do understand caching is going to come into picture. So think from the first day how you are going to handle the caching piece. So I think most of the people who have already done a lot of work in software, they understand caching as a very important piece, and they must have chosen the first option. And the people who have started to code, or who are in a process of discovering the scale at which the caching is going to come, they might have chosen third option, and they believe that when the right time will come, then we'll think about caching. People who don't know caching, I hope they now understand. Caching means to make the data which does not change a lot being located as closer to the user as possible. Let's say images, for example, on the website, we pull the images, we store it into the web cache or browser cache, so that when we ask the data again, we don't go to the server, rather we pick it from the web cache itself. So these are the things that we covered today. We'll try to understand more. This was my first session. Really, I did have to put a lot of things in order to make this live session work. It will get much more efficient, and I will get much more efficient. We'll talk about in a more structured manner, better than this. This was a trial run. I thank everybody who participated in this trial run, and bear with me. The poll results were great. People do fall into different opinions that we saw, and we try to understand why do they fall into different category. So great. Thank you for joining this session. I'll meet you in some other session. Very quickly we'll do it, and there will be a lot of improvement that we will do. Thank you. Yes, there will be some code overview. So there is one very important piece. I'm developing an open source project which is near completion. There I have Redis implementation in a node based server, and I will host a session on that, and I'll show the code pieces how it is working, and you'll understand that in actual code implementation how you can have a cache implemented. Great. So thank you for joining my first live session. I'll meet you very soon on the next one. Thank you.